Hello and welcome everyone from our wonderful summer learning and out of school time community. We are very grateful that you are taking time out of your busy day to join us again. This is our day 2 of our Summer Solution Leadership Series. Following yesterday, we had an amazing day with our award-winning programs, very inspiring, and also former Secretary of Education John King speaking about program quality and what it takes to run high quality experiences and summer learning opportunities for all young people in the country and how to do that well, especially during COVID. Today's theme is going to shift a little bit and focus a little more on the recent election that we just had, understanding what it means for education and all of our work, as well as what are some policy recommendations and ideas and efforts that are underway to influence and implications for the new Congress and new administration. Just to take 1 second and go back, so for anyone who doesn't know, we are the National Summer Learning Association. We've been around for 25 years, partnering with thousands of organizations and leaders to help close the opportunity and education gaps, which we believe grow most dramatically over the summer months. And we work to focus on serving all students, but especially those who are most vulnerable, to combat summer learning loss, and again, to put everyone in experience in position to access and afford a high quality summer learning experience every year, which we know will have a huge impact on their lives. If you go to the next slide, Leslie. We've been creating a lot of resources, which we will be sharing to all of you who are joining, that we hope you can utilize in your programs and in your work. But just a quick reminder why summer matters to all of us, in our opinion, is we believe it's a critical time for students and families, but it's a time for improvement. It's a time to be intentional and not only to help students catch up and keep up and propel forward, but also with staff. It's the most investable time in staff development. So that's something. When you look at summer, we're helping students and adults. It's also a major time for innovation in education, and so many of our partners and all of you and calling in are doing creative things, and especially during COVID, the time has called for more creativity than ever. It's also a time for integration and breaking down silos in education between the school day and the out of school time and the summer camp world and all these different wonderful resources we have of being more coordinated. And again, we're seeing that more than ever in this time of COVID. And as we were saying, it's a time of impact, but lots of things can have impact. One of the reasons summer has a huge impact is because by definition, it's a time of transition in life between one grade to the next, from one school to the next. And that this is a chance when people are in transition. It's a time of vulnerability, but it's also a time to be open and learn and really have a huge lasting impact on folks. Transition is what our country is in with the election, and we're going to be talking about that. And I just want to come back to the next slide, Leslie, just to show that people will have some resources made available to them. We will get to our next session, but I just want to highlight these, and we'll be talking about some of them, and you'll have access to them. But we did work with our partners at the After School Alliance and many other award-winning programs to take and collect lessons from this past summer. Summer like no other, lessons from the field during COVID-19. We think that'll be a very useful resource for many, as well as we had a summer and continuous learning task force that created a playbook for supporting programs to influence policymakers and support them and educators that could be useful. We did a updated federal funding resource guide, which will, I imagine, have to be updated again, but it could be useful for a lot of folks. And finally, we have a recent 2020 state policy snapshot, which is just being released today, that we will share and make available to everyone. So these are some of the resources. We also provide technical assistance as people are working to be very intentional and plan for next summer. And we have a whole field consultant team and technical assistance department that can support any of you who are struggling to figure out how do we make next summer as impactful as possible. So that is what's going on. I'll just share as we shift to this election that we've all experienced and are processing and we're very invested in. Tip O'Neill always said all politics is local. And I think we see more than ever that what happens at the federal level impacts us locally. And that also it's about choices and about the future. And elections are about what kind of future we want to create together, what direction we want to take our country and our communities. And finally, it gets into the real discussion about budgets. And a lot of people find budgets are boring and maybe a little dry, but I've always been very passionate about budgets because ultimately I believe that budgets are about choices, and those choices are about values. And that's why people fight so hard in these elections to kind of influence what are the directions, what are the choices, and what are the values we want to see and work towards. So with that said, we have an amazing panel right now, going to be moderated by Reggie Love, who serves as Vice Chair of the National Board of Directors of the National Summer Learning Association. Many of you may know Reggie and be familiar with Reggie from his work as an aide to President Barack Obama, both on his first campaign and in the second campaign and in the first administration. He also had an illustrious athletic career at Duke University. So whenever people from Duke know Reggie, he was on a team, he was captain of a team that won the national championship and played football and basketball. Also as an author, wrote an amazing memoir about his life experiences, Power Forward, which we would encourage people to check out, and now has had a long career in business as well. So he sits at the nexus between business and government and nonprofit work, and we're really excited to have his perspective and his skills in moderating our panel with our education roundtable. So I will turn it over to Reggie.
Well, Aaron, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I think Shane Battier may take offense to it because in 2001, he was the captain. I was a captain in 2005. We did not win a national championship, but we did win the ACC tournament, and we made a Sweet 16 appearance. And thank you for all the work that you do on such an important topic that often flies under the radar. Many people don't always understand how, education doesn't only start and happen within the four walls of the buildings as we know at school. And organizations like NSLA, I think have just been doing a great job in highlighting how we look at children as a whole and educate them throughout their entire formative years. My mother always taught me that education is the one thing that no one can take away from you, and is one of the great equalizers. And so I think to your point, Aaron, about budgets and what are priorities, people say you figure out what people's priorities are on how they spend their money. And so it's great to have such a great group today to have a conversation about how this upcoming election and the results from this election will have an impact on how we view the priorities around education. And I think the stakes are super high for children and families after this unprecedented season, which has showcased the tale of two Americas on the heels of an election. I think we've got a great opportunity for this country to deal with a lot of issues around race, health, education, economics, and strategy for the recovery for this country. So I'll introduce our panelists. You can find their full bios at summerlearning.org/events. We have Joseph Williams from U.S. News and World Report. We have Eric Roblin, who is from the Education Writers Association as a deputy director there. We have Andrew Ijusa from Education Week, and I apologize if I did not hit that right. And we also have Valerie Strauss from the Washington Post. And clearly, it feels like for the last almost 4 years that journalists have been under attack by folks in the current administration. And so, I want to not only thank you all for being here today to have this conversation with us, but also want to thank you all for the work that you guys do in, keeping the country and constituents educated on such important topics. What you guys do every day, guys and girls do every day, it really matters, and appreciate all that service. So thank you. I'd say, so I'll start with, a broad question for everyone. And on my camera, I have sort of have a Joe and Valerie on the same line, and Eric and Andrew on the other. And so I'll start with you, Joe, and I'd love to hear from all the panelists on, what do the results from this election mean for education from your perspective?
Well, from my perspective, I think it's definitely a split result. We don't really know exactly what the population is thinking. It seems like they're talking with a split voice. That on the one hand, they do appreciate what Trumpism represents because we have almost 48% of the population who voted for the president, and it was a nail-biter election when everyone was expecting a blowout. So basically, that's a little bit of a mixed message from the public. But I think overall, because they elected, the majority elected Joe Biden president, a lot of that is speaking towards education as something that we need to make a priority. I mean, famously, his wife is a community college professor, and she's very much in the education landscape. So I think that we're moving towards a direction away from the Voss policies, which were very much charter schools over everything, and public education was a secondary resource. That's what it said to me. What the changes will mean going forward remains to be seen.
Great. Valerie?
I agree with all of that. I think for education, we are talking at the federal level of a major change away from DeVos's priority of school choice, of her admiration for-profit college education. We're going to see all kinds of moves away from her attack on civil rights of students of color and LGBTQ. I also think that from what we have heard from Joe Biden over the last 9-10 months, is that we will not see actually a return to the Obama education policies, because I think he's moved from some of those. I think he believed in them earlier on, but I do not think he wants to make charter schools a priority. He's even made some comments about charter schools that have made the charter world a little upset about wanting to bring more transparency to their operations. I think we may see some student debt be abolished by Biden through regulation or executive order. So I think we're going to see a lot. Now, that said, the state legislatures didn't really change. And a lot of what happens in education is at the state level. There are, so the move toward choice will remain at the state level. But the one thing that I think we should really watch Joe Biden, if he does this, is to try to change the way schools funded. Now, the way that he can do that is by sort of dangling federal funds to states that are going to really be in desperate need of federal funds if they do certain things, much like Obama did with Race to the Top. He put out a lot of grant money and said, if you do what I want, you can have this. And Biden could do that with trying to force more equity into the funding system.
That's great. Eric, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure, I'm happy to kind of piggyback on some of this. As we know, and it was mentioned with divided government, a big question is whether the Senate is going to remain in Republican hands. If it does, that's going to sharply curtail what a Biden administration will be able to accomplish, especially on the legislative front. So that's a really big open question. And either way, it's going to be such a narrow margin that that's also going to make it a lot harder for him to govern and get policy enacted. I do think that you'll want to watch for some of the authority that the administration has to take actions, and other panelists have already mentioned this, around executive actions they can take. There's already been talk of rolling back some of the actions that Secretary DeVos made. And in those cases, that was sort of reversing policies from the Obama administration. So there's going to be some of that. And we had someone from the policy director for the campaign talked at an EWA webinar recently, where she talked about some of that and some of the issues like Title IX, and how the department would look at things like sexual assault on campus and the protections for certain student populations, that those are going to be issues that, like transgender students, for example, that they'll look at. I also though want to kind of echo the point about state and local elections, because state and local level is where the power is at these days in big ways. I mean, it always has been, and in the era with the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, that kind of still more handed back increased authority to the state and local level. And it was mostly a status quo election outcome at the state levels. Valerie's exactly right. There were 2 legislative chambers that flipped from Democrat to Republican control. None other changed. And I remember seeing before the election, Cook Political Report and others were saying as many as 19 chambers could have flipped from Republican to Democratic or vice versa. And most of those favored the Democrats, but they did not see that. That did not happen. And then likewise, 9 governors were reelected, and then you have 2 new governors, Greg Gianforte in Montana and Spencer Cox in Utah. So, there's not a lot of change at that level. And remember, just in one of the most emblematic examples of the power of states and localities, they're the ones, for example, making these decisions on the whole about reopening schools or going to some kind of hybrid, et cetera. So, the levers of power in so many ways rest there. One last thing is that there were some interesting ballot measures that, if we want to talk about that, I could mention, like in Arizona, they actually passed a measure the voters did to increase education spending, and a few other states did things like that.
No, I think those are really good points. And in your mind, do you think that because state legislatures have not changed, that COVID and the response of local officials around COVID outweighed how people felt about our current, what people felt locally about their current education opportunities? Or do you think that that sign meant that people were pretty pleased and happy with where they are locally with how their local representatives view education and those education policies?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I know enough. I'd love to see sort of the exit polling to see what motivated people to vote one way or the other. It's hard to say, although certainly with the ones where it was a ballot measure on education spending, there you can feel like, okay, they had a chance to directly decide. And there were a few cases where they were willing to, increase spending. Usually it's tied to like a tax increase on the wealthy, I think, in Arizona. So yeah, that was an issue.
Okay. Well, and Andrew, I posed the question to you, and as Eric mentioned, if there is this division within the executive branch and the legislative branch, do you think there will be executive order opportunities or things that President Biden would try to do through executive order to drive incremental change within the educational space?
So the short answer is yes. I think the Obama administration and then the Trump administration also proved that the pen and phone approach to education can have a great deal of impact. Folks have alluded to this earlier, but I think that Biden has indicated that he would restore, for example, guidance from the Obama years covering transgender students, racial disparities in student discipline. Those are relatively easy from an executive branch standpoint to sort of snap back into place. That's not to say those measures are universally popular, but I think you can expect that those would be restored pretty quickly. And also, it's been brought up a few times, but I would just say that the immediate focus of the Biden administration, however Congress looks, could easily be divided, as folks have said, as COVID, COVID, COVID. That means pushing for as big a relief package as he can get. Will that mean $175 billion for education in a general fund? Will that mean $100 billion? That remains to be seen. They're also going to be looking at the education department for any flexibilities they can provide to schools that folks are pushing for. That doesn't mean schools and districts and states will be able to get away with anything, but it does mean that they're going to be looking for areas where schools have more flexibility to address student needs. One thing to focus on there is testing. Are they going to waive tests that are regularly mandated by federal law? And also, I would just point out that Biden talks about educators frequently and in a way that the Trump administration has not. He's clearly centered educators. And as to go along with that, union members, folks have mentioned Jill Biden. She's actually an NEA member, which I think has played a role in things. And it could also play a role in who he picks for education secretary, which is sort of what everyone is chattering about in the Beltway at the moment. But yeah, I would just stress that from a relief package to regulatory relief, the early focus of the Biden administration is going to be COVID, COVID, COVID.
And so go ahead, Eric.
Oh, I'm sorry. One thing I just for 1 second wanted to go back to your question, Reggie, about what the voters had to say. One interesting, maybe and surprising to some development was in California on affirmative action, where the voters were invited to reverse a ban on affirmative action in California, which is generally seen as a more liberal leaning state, certainly Democratic state, and the voters said no to that. So that was just one example. And especially at this moment, given how much racial equity is at the fore, I thought that was a noteworthy and some would probably say a surprising decision.
No, I definitely saw that and was surprised by it, and I was actually surprised by that compared to some of the other ballot measures, there was not as much spent on that specific topic as well, given the state of the country. I was really surprising. So I guess the real question is, I think there's a lot of things that we think could potentially change, but if we had to say, what do we think will be the first topic or issue that Congress and this administration will tackle first? You know, any particular ideas around, emerging around learning loss or meeting the diverse needs of students with different learning disabilities? And I'll start. We'll go in reverse order now. We'll start with Andrew, and then we'll come back to Joe. Snake draft.
All right, so from caboose to engine. All right. So yeah, I mentioned that COVID is going to be the focus, and I think it remains to be seen what, if anything, Congress is going to pass and Trump will sign during the so-called lame duck period in terms of COVID relief. I have to say that anyone who follows anything about this is not particularly optimistic about getting another relief package through, and even if there is one before Biden's inauguration, it could be relatively small. So I imagine there's going to be a lot of appetite for some sort of relief package on January 20th. The question is how much? Was there one during the lame duck? The previous relief package that involved money for schools, the CARES Act, passed in March, which probably feels like 20,000 years ago now. So I think a lot has changed, obviously, for everybody, including for schools, about the issues they're addressing. And I think learning loss is going to be an issue. Like, how do schools address that lag or interrupted learning, whatever you want to call it? What are existing federal programs that could be brought to bear? I know some of your folks are familiar with legislation from, I believe, Tina Smith and Lisa Murkowski to sort of allow after-school resources to be used during what would normally be regular school hours. So just things like that. I wonder if that's going to be incorporated. And, everything from liability for schools, what's that going to look like in the context of COVID? How is the relief package going to deal with that? There are so many moving parts to this, but I think that it will be an issue that's going to get a lot of attention very quickly, both during the lame duck and once Biden takes office.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And if the COVID trends keep happening the way they're happening, will there be pressure to maybe do a relief package before the new administration? Would be super interesting to see how that plays out. Eric, what do you think will be first?
Sure. I think Andrew's exactly right. A stimulus or whatever you want to call this emergency package has to be the first thing. And, that could be a major development for schools and universities and after school and whatnot. depending on the composition of it. And frankly, I wonder if people are going to start mobilizing in just randomly in the state of Kentucky. I have to wonder if local officials in a place like Kentucky, the home of the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, if he were to feel in that state that this is really something that's needed, whether that might have an impact. Certainly, I have to imagine small businesses and others there are probably struggling. So I think that this is going to be it's a huge question, and it's certainly a huge opportunity, depending on which way they go, to see what kind of decision they can come to about a stimulus. But it's they've not made the progress people had anticipated for months, that they were going to cut a deal, and then it didn't happen. And now it seems like the Trump administration is not really as focused on it anymore. So, in the kind of closing days. So that's a big question mark, but there's so much there. The one plug I will make for an issue that I'm guessing would be near and dear to this audience is the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, which is, I checked, and I think in this latest budget, it was approved at $1.25 billion. So it's a very large program. And it's been very stable and very bipartisan. So I doubt you're going to see much change to that, other than sort of the budgetary pressures that may come to bear on, whether there's going to be pressure now to cut back in some way overall spending. Certainly, I'm sure the Biden administration would not support that. But at some point, they're going to have to cut a deal on the budget for the federal agencies, leaving aside the stimulus. And so that's going to be another thing that has to happen at some point, even if there's impasses on other kind of optional, I want to say, legislation that isn't like required to keep the engines, the government open.
No, that's great. Valerie, do you have any thoughts on that differ that will potentially be a priority for?
I just have a few quick thoughts. First of all, I don't think that if the Republicans hold the Senate, and on some level, even if they don't, but if they do for sure, which is the most likely thing, there's nothing in Mitch McConnell's history that shows that he's going to be wanting to negotiate many deals on many topics, including education, with the Biden administration. So Biden's going to have to do, as has been noted before, like Obama and Trump did with executive order and regulatory changes. And I do think that we know that Biden's team is putting together a long list of things that he can do, A, the first day, and then B, the first 100 days, to roll back a lot of what's been doing. So the first day he's going to sign, he's going to reverse the Dreamers. And he's going to start doing those things, and we'll see some of those in education. But I'm not particularly hopeful that there'll be much compromise between Congress and Biden. In fact, Congress didn't even give Trump and DeVos what they wanted in terms of the education budgets. They tried to cut them, Congress gave them more money. They wanted a federal voucher program, Congress didn't give it to them. So I don't know about that kind of working together like that.
That's really, I think that's very insightful. Hopefully, I hope that those things happen as well. And Joe, would love to get your thoughts, and then you're going to be back on the hot seat again for the for the next
twofer. Okay, well, basically, there's not much left to pick over after our four esteemed panelists said what they said. But I think one thing that I think bears thinking about, besides the fact that, yes, I think absolutely there will have to be some kind of addressing of the COVID crisis in public schools, and that could mean anything from more aid to kind of a determination on what priorities they want to make in terms of liability and for teachers. But I also think that we're going to have a complete reshuffling of the deck, no matter who controls Congress. We're going to have a new education secretary. We're also going to have a new chairman of the Help Committee, whether that person is Republican or Democrat, replacing Lamar Alexander, and whether or not that new person has the relationships to get things done remains to be seen. Not to mention the fact that so far President-elect Biden has been talking a lot about and been lobbied to, to have one of his first acts become student debt relief for college students, because it's something that he can do without Congress, presumably. It's something that he can do that would offer almost immediate relief without having to spend a dime of the federal checkbook, or at least not without having to go to Congress for an appropriation. That's low-hanging fruit. It's something that will signal also that he's serious about these sorts of economic reforms that progressives want him to address. So you have those two items, and the education secretary is going to be a huge decision, because can you get that person through Congress? A lot of chatter has been around two union leaders of the NEA and of the Education Association. So those two leaders would face an uphill battle in a Republican Congress, but they would signal also how hard Biden's willing to fight for some of the progressive education initiatives that he's talked about on the campaign trail. So all in all, he's probably got a long list, as Valerie has said. He's probably got COVID on his mind, as Andrew said, and as Eric mentioned, there's got to be some kind of addressing of where we go from here in terms of K-12 education in a COVID era. But I also kind of wonder, what are we going to do about learning loss? Because there's going to be some learning loss. I've got my high school senior sitting about a few feet to the left of me, going to class online, and it's clear that some of the lessons that he's lost from the previous 12 years may not stick with him when it's time to go to college. So I think that's, even though it might not necessarily be the sexiest item on the list or the first item on the list, I think at some point it's got to be addressed, because it is a real thing. And we've got a lot of new freshmen, new college freshmen who are going to college online, and that's going to throw a lot of upheaval into the system. So I think it's got to be all of that and more. And he's got a huge task ahead of him, regardless of what he decides to tackle first.
Yeah, no, I think that's a huge issue. Such a tough thing to have to deal with, and parents like yourselves have been doing your best to try to supplement or augment these very challenging access issues for incoming freshmen. But look, for COVID as a whole, you could say that it's had a significantly statistically higher impact on Black and Latino Americans. And these statistics mean that Black and Latino children are more likely to face stress and anxiety, as family members are disproportionately losing jobs, getting sick, facing food insecurity, putting themselves at risk of exposure in order to make ends meet. And we know these threats can have a profound impact on a student's emotional well-being and subsequently their ability to learn. Do you see an administration responding to these social detriments of health and learning barriers for students currently?
Well, I mean, back on Earth 1, yeah, I absolutely think that in normal times we would see something that would address that. I mean, and I was thinking, as you were talking about that, and I was describing my son over there attending class. I mean, I'm lucky. I have a job. I have Wi-Fi. He's going to a good school. He's got a lot of teacher support because he's special needs. He's on the spectrum, which is a whole other kettle of fish that we may not have time to get into here. But I think it's absolutely going to have an impact, and it would be great if we had a Republican congressional majority, even some moderates who might say, you know what, this is a big problem. We're going to have to address it with our Democratic colleagues. But as everybody's predicting, we are likely to have a split Senate at the very best case scenario for getting things done. I mean, most presidents come in with majorities in both houses. This president is going to come in with majorities perhaps in both houses, but just barely. So that means tacking towards the center and not healing to the left. So that's going to drop a lot of pressure on President-elect Biden to not go big, because we've heard a lot of discussion from Republicans about austerity. That's the watchword now. They're talking about buttoning up the federal checkbook now that they've got a new administration to deal with. And as was mentioned before, the previous administration wanted to curtail funds. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they decide to go along with the program. but clearly there's going to be needed federal specially targeted relief for some communities. I mean, you know, African Americans by and large are suffering from the virus, and those are parents who are having to go out every day and risk getting sick, or if they do get sick, their child may not be able to continue school, or may not be able to continue school in the manner in which they had grown accustomed. We've got a lot of food insecurity problems where I was driving past a local church the other day in downtown Silver Spring on Georgia Avenue. The line to get into the food bank on traffic was literally a 1.5 mile long. And you have police out there directing traffic to make sure that everybody gets in smoothly. And that's the first time I've ever seen that. I've worked with food banks and I've never seen the need this great. So unless the Republican Congress completely turns a blind eye to this, or the majority can't be persuaded, I fear that we're in for really hard times as far as that's concerned.
Well, we got a lot of hands raised. Valerie, do you have anything to say? You didn't raise your hand.
Well, why don't we let Andrew and Eric, who have their hands raised, talk about this?
Okay. All right. Eric, why don't you start?
Sure. I'll just say super briefly that Steph Feldman, the policy director for Biden, who spoke at our event, she actually identified as one of kind of 5 parts of a Biden strategy around COVID-19 and reopening schools. One of them was what she called the COVID-19 education gap. So this is on their radar already as an important issue. As we know, getting them, that presumably would require significant resources to do something meaningful on that. So whether or not they can get bipartisan support, we'll see. But it is something that was explicitly identified there by her.
I think that's spot on. That's good. That's a very good point. Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on what Joe was saying. Biden likes to say he's going to listen to the experts, listen to the scientists, and part of his plan for reopening schools does include sort of a task force that will develop recommendations to support students' mental health and emotional well-being. Now, who's on that panel, what recommendations they make, and how seriously folks at the state and local level take it, we obviously don't know yet, but to use Eric's phrase, it is on the radar. It's also going to be interesting to see to what extent the vaccine, when we have one, presumably in a few months, if not sooner, how that's rolled out to different organizations and entities, including schools and related groups. There's a CDC plan that's sort of been cooking about educators being part of the second wave of folks who get the vaccine. Whether or not that actually takes shape, comes to pass, I'm not sure. And also, something you hear a lot from people in the education space is that they just want guidance and technical assistance from the Biden administration, along with money. That's probably the single most common thing you hear. Now, what that means for different folks obviously varies depending on their circumstances, but I think the Biden administration would move pretty quickly to push out sort of color-coded guidance with clear benchmarks. But even then, keep in mind that some of that guidance and recommendations might not match what states are putting out there for when schools and entities like schools say, this is when you should open, this is when you have to open or close. So that mismatch between federal and state guidance and information could continue to be a problem because there are different people at the controls with different political leanings.
I would like to throw something in, piggybacking on that, and that is that there is going to be just so much the Biden administration can do. Education policy largely is state and local, and so even when we talk about learning loss, addressing it, coming up, districts have difficulty dealing with it. There's always learning loss. Every year there's learning loss. Kids come back and there's learning loss, and some districts are better at remediating it than others. And those are some of the kinds of things superintendents have told me they plan to try to do. But we have an accountability system that's going to make it even harder because we have standardized tests that evaluate kids about what they're supposed to know at a certain grade. So this pandemic could wind up changing a whole lot of things, but one thing it probably won't change is that states and districts, state legislatures are still going to want to make their own education policy, and that is going to clash with federal policy.
Yeah, no, and I think, and to be totally honest, especially when you look at how all the states are responding to what are the methodologies around our COVID response and for our schools, you start there, and the gap will only continue to widen. And so one, I think I'm supposed to make an announcement to all of our participants on this Zoom today that we're going to do Q&A here in a short bit. We have had some questions coming in, but just wanted to tell everyone that if you have a question, there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom app that if you would like to throw questions in for our Q&A portion, would love to include those. And I'll start. And so my last question will just be for Valerie, and if others want to chime in, please let me know. Given these gaps, so what are you hearing around a science-based approach to school reopenings, small learning hubs or other hybrid models that might, emerge differently in a new Congress and under a new administration?
Well, I think this goes back to states. As you've seen, all the very different ways states have approached it, depending on whether the governor believes in science or doesn't believe in science. I don't think that the federal government is going to be able to force states that want to do what they want to do to do what they want. I think the way they can do this, again, is by putting controls into federal funds that they put out there, and states can decide whether they want to do it. That does not guarantee a national approach. I'm not particularly sanguine about this a science-based approach being grasped by everybody. We've seen that just doesn't happen in this country.
Joe,
well, yeah, and I would agree with Valerie, and that points out to one of the huge challenges that the administration is coming in. I mean, even today, we have states that had initially resisted issuing a mask mandate. Now they're doing so. Governors are issuing mask mandates, and local sheriffs are saying, no, we're not going to do that because it impinges upon our freedoms. And so you look at a district like New York, for example. I mean, huge district, probably one of the leading, what New York does, people tend to follow. They can't even get it right in terms of science-based. They try to take a science-based approach with a certain degree of precision, as much precision they could muster, and they still ended up closing. So I think one of the things that I've said often in certain circles is that the virus is going to get the last word. I mean, we're going to try to combat it as much as we can. We're going to do as much as we can. But because we're so split on it, and because we have so many diametrically opposite ideas about what it means to fight the virus and how we should do that and what the best practices are, you're not going to have a unified situation. You're going to have guidance. You're going to have suggestions. You may even have, as Valerie suggested, money tied to strictures, tied to things that you must do in order to get these grants. Doesn't mean that the states have to take it. And one other thing I did want to kind of posit is that we are going to enter a new era of learning. I think that there are going to be sweeping changes for a lot of things. I mean, even thinking about local issues. I mean, I'm pretty sure we're not going to go back where my son is concerned. We're not going to go back to the 7 a.m. get on the bus model. We're probably not going to go back to, even once schools reopen, we're probably not going to go back to that. We're probably going to have some more forms of hybrid education. We're probably going to have smaller classes, and who knows what that's going to mean for policy and funding going ahead, especially when so much is going to change all at once.
No, I love those comments, and I do think that figuring out how to work with our states and putting the right carrots and sticks in place to incentivize folks to take the science seriously will be important. And that will take us, I think we have a really good question from one of the participants, from Jermaine, who has brought up an issue calling an agenda of children first. And do we think, can we really hope that for a change in the state level when there's so many politics and agendas that come before our children? And should we be working strategically to push a children's first agenda? do you think that that would potentially be more unifying? And I'll field that to any one of the panelists.
I think that depends on what you mean by children's first. I mean, the Republican policy is about school choice. They're all about children first because we don't want to get kids out of failing schools. While the Democrats' position on schools is public schools, more funding, they think that that's the child first approach. So I think it all depends on the eye of the beholder. So even then, I don't think we'd necessarily have unity as far as putting children first, because nobody can decide exactly what that means.
We don't believe in the science on COVID or the science around best ways to educate children. All right. That's very, very
That's me, the
inspiring.
optimist.
Let's go I'm going to go to another topic.
I mean, just quickly, I am trying not to be such a pessimist, and I do think that educators sincerely believe that what they're doing puts children ahead, because we have some schools that open because of emotional problems, because children are staying home and they're not engaging with their peers, they're having social development issues, which is a very legitimate concern.
Yeah, well, I think that's spot on. But maybe I'm trying to be hopeful. Now, Eric or Andrew or Valerie, do you have comments on children's first sort of agenda, or should we go on to the next?
I'll just throw something out really quickly, and it speaks to what Joe says, is children first. What does that mean? If it's not children first, is that supposed to be a slap that the teachers only care about themselves and the unions only fight for the teachers? Anybody in public education will tell you everything they do is for children first. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But, you know, when we talk about child-centered, I think different people think different things. Having children help decide what they're going to study. That's one way, is to have them more active in their mode of education and their path of education. Child-centered can mean wraparound services, can mean more focus on mental health. It can be on all kinds of things. And will there be universal approval for something like that? No, there won't. There almost never is.
Right. We've got a softball, maybe a harder question to answer, but maybe a little bit quicker. Do we have predictions for Secretary of Education?
Well, my pick pulled out. I thought it was going to be Linda Darling-Hammond, the secretary that everybody thought Obama was going to pick and didn't. She's running Biden's transition team, and I thought that was a signal that she was going to be Secretary of Education. And then she said she doesn't want to do it. She's the president of the California Board of Education and wants to stay there. So they're floating. The transition team is floating names to see what comes back. Yes, the two heads of the major teachers unions are supposed to be in that mix, and they may well be. Senate confirmation could be difficult. He could make them acting like Trump did with practically half of his or more of his cabinet, who knows. But there are all kinds of names. The newest name I heard was Donna Shalala, who just lost her seat in the House from Miami.
I'll make a prediction,
Eric,
which is maybe not a name, but I think that given the incredible political polarization around K-12 education, especially at the federal level, I'm going to bet that they go with someone from higher education. I know they said during the campaign, President-elect's campaign said that, you know, we're going to have someone from public education, someone experienced with that. And during the webinar we asked, so does that mean at the K-12 level, the higher ed level? And she didn't want to get that specific, but I would not be at all surprised if this time they go with someone from higher education for a variety of reasons, including that it might be a little less politically divisive.
Okay. Andrew, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, again, I don't want to offer names, but if I had $1 for every time someone from the K-12 space actually suggested that we pick someone from a public college or university, I could afford a lot of takeout right now. I think there is a lot of appetite for someone from that. I think one of the things that the DeVos Trump years demonstrated is that, and a lot of people on the panel know this, is that the education secretary and the education department actually have arguably a lot more power over higher education in terms of regulatory actions and things like that than they do over K-12. I do think there's pressure on and within the Biden team to pick someone from K-12 just because that's traditionally how it's gone. I would also just note that if you look at how the department works and what they do, a lot of it, if not their primary job, is dealing with states. Valerie alluded to the power that states have in setting a lot of these education policies. That speaks to arguably the primary job that the department has. So I would not be shocked if it's someone from a state background, including from maybe a state college or university, even if it's not the sexiest name out there. If it's someone that the unions can signal that they support, then a state person might make a lot of sense for the Biden team.
I'd just like to throw in that Biden did promise repeatedly on the campaign trail that he was going to pick, sometimes he said educator, sometimes he said teacher. And I think that he set up an expectation in the K-12 world, whether he meant to or not, that it was going to be from the K-12 world. Now, I won't be surprised if it's not. As Eric said, and Andrew said, I won't be surprised if it's not. But I think that he set himself up for that, and there could be a lot of disappointment, even if the union chiefs go along with it, in that world if he doesn't.
Okay. And Joe, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I've learned after the last two elections that making a prediction is folly if you live in DC, so I'm not going to do that. But I do think that for all intents and purposes, or I should say for most intents and purposes, I think charter schools and vouchers, I'm not sure they're going to go very much further than they've gone with the Trump administration. I think a Biden administration is probably going to take a dim view of, or at least not as an embracing view of privates and charters as the two previous administrations have. So I think that's going to be a sea change for a lot of education boards out there. And I also think that he's placed them on notice about the disciplinary gap. Changes are coming, and I don't think it's going to be to schools getting state money to be very selective about their populations.
Okay, I appreciate that. And on names, I won't make a guess myself, but on names, I will apologize for mispronouncing Joe Mani's name on that previous question. So my apologies for that. And I'd wrap it up with one last question. And I think, you know, as someone who has spent some time now in the business community and business world, you know, Chris Conklin asked a very good question about how can those of us at educational supply, publishing companies, or other industries, he is specifically at Carson DeLosa, how can they best communicate with districts to address learning interruptions or summer slide? And I'll start with, we'll start with Eric, since you haven't got a chance to start first.
I'm actually going to take a pass on that one. I'm not sure that I have an immediate answer that'd be worth much.
Okay. Anyone have thoughts on this topic? What can industries do to have more of a vocal presence with local policymakers around education?
Well, I'd say I would just throw in that they already do. I mean, the business world has been very involved in pushing education reform for 20 years, particularly the last 10 years. So I'm not really sure what more, you know, I'm not sure what else they can do that they haven't done, except put in more money and for, you know, for the kinds of programs that they like. They have, they set up scholarships and things like that, and they lobby for what they want. I don't know anything else that right now that they're going to be able to do, except maybe start making more masks for schools.
Well, I was gonna piggyback on that and say, yeah, money is always the great lubricator in education. So I think if they wanted to make a difference, I think offering some kind of relief to schools or offering their products either at a reduced price or at cost or at wholesale, I think that'd be a grand gesture. They're always controversial, these education companies, because educators view them with suspicion. People outside of school boards don't really know what they're doing or if they're making deals behind closed doors. So a bit of transparency, a modicum of transparency, I think would go a long way too. So in addition to like their relationships with school districts and with other educators, I think they've got to come forward. They've got to make a gesture of offering money to whoever needs it, even if it isn't one of their prime customers, reduce costs on their services or their textbooks or their materials, making them a lower cost availability, if not free, and making a gesture towards transparency and meeting parents and educators and others who kind of look askance at these companies halfway and maybe have a dialogue about what they can do better, because now is a time for change, right? The former chief of staff of your old boss, Barack Obama, used to say, "Don't let a good crisis go to waste." I mean, now we've got many crises. So we've got a lot of opportunities to like make some changes, and I think some changes will come out of it. If that's one of them, I personally would be very, very in favor of that.
During the pandemic, private internet companies and manufacturers of computers did step up in some communities to provide free or low cost internet service, but a lot of them had to be asked first. They didn't come to, they didn't go to the school districts. They had to be asked first. So I think, as Joe suggests, a little more wherewithal on their part.
Yeah, and everybody's hurting, so they'd not go lacking for opportunities.
Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. All of you are clearly very educated on the topic of education and are very good at articulating a lot of these challenges that we've faced in the past and that we're going to continue to face in the future. Your voices on this topic, I believe, will continue to help not only to inform the general public, but also to inform and inspire our legislatures at a national level and at a local level when we start talking about how we can continue to evolve. And Joe, I love your comment about transparency. Barack Obama, another favorite line that he always said was that, transparency and sunlight are the best disinfectants. And so if we really have problems with spaces, making transparency a priority is a good comment. So I think, and someone please correct me if I'm wrong, Laura or Leslie, I think I'm now going to turn this back over to Aaron as we transition into our next panel discussion, and just wanted to again to thank our current panelists for spending such a great afternoon with us to discuss such important topics.
Well, thank you, Reggie. Great having you.
Yeah. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Valerie, Andrew, Eric, Joe. We really appreciate your insights. And we should all encourage all our listeners today to continue to read you and follow you, and because it's not all of us have our lens on what's going on, but you all have a much broader lens and can help us tie pieces together that is so important more than ever now. So thank you. Hello, thank you, Reggie, for facilitating that session. We'll give you a little bit of a break, but we hope people will stay on, because now we're going to kind of move the conversation into the perspectives of education leaders, national leaders who are fighting very hard and advocating very hard on behalf of children and in our field. And just before I introduce them and we take the conversation to what this new election and what we can do as a summer learning and out of school time field together to push for our priorities and hopefully find shared priorities, just want to do a little reminder that we've released a new kind of short brief with lessons from last summer. We call it A Summer Like No Other, Lessons from the Field During COVID-19. And this combines the efforts of the After School Alliance, which has done an amazing job. We're going to hear from their CEO, Jody Grant, in a second, but doing huge, tremendously valuable surveys of more than 1,000 programs across the country, and continuing with these surveys. But together we were supporting them around a survey of summer program providers last summer. And there were a lot of real struggles, but I would also say that there was a lot of silver linings of inspiration and how hard people worked to go above and beyond and find solutions and be creative and be collaborative in new ways and engage stakeholders. We heard even yesterday of programs that were staff lost their funding and they kept working because everyone was so focused on keeping the programs going for students. Some of the highlights of our report, I'll just go very quickly so we can maybe include them in our conversation. But obviously, huge challenges around technology and access to the internet. That's something we all continue to struggle with. We had the George Floyd, we had a lot of other issues of racial and social injustice that people needed to respond to and continue to respond to. And I think a lot of programs that were working with young people didn't feel that they necessarily had all the training and the tools and the curriculum and everything they needed to respond in the moment, but it was something people were tackling. Guidance just on virtual learning in of itself, even once you had the technology, how do you do that in a way that's engaging, fun, and effective, popped up. And then some of the other feedback we heard from focus groups. So in combination with the survey of the After School Alliance, we went out and looked and interviewed our award-winning programs over the past years to find out what worked well from them. And we got a few pieces of feedback. And one is the idea, and some of this is obvious, but if you were more entrenched in the community and really had deep relationships in the community and with students and families, you were able to pivot and do better. People trusted you already. They wanted to come back. You knew how to kind of navigate. You had the built-in relationship. And also something that our whole field does so well is focus on the whole child and the social emotional development. Obviously, it was a huge strength. And then just tactically, early decision making. A lot of us were waiting for guidance till the very last second before the summer, and even now with the school year starting again. And those that moved quickly and just made a decision about how they were going to operate were able to plan more and just be a little more effective. And then we saw a lot of creativity around the hybrid of dropping off home kits and following up and using vans of institutions that had no one to drive to. And they were just a lot of different clever things that were happening to get resources into the hands of students and families. And then of course, partnerships between the school districts and out of school time. So there's a lot more in that brief, but again, I just want to raise some of those issues that came out of that. It comes from many of the people on our call today. And now we're gonna pivot and do just a quick introduction, and I'll let Reggie take it from there. And I'm actually going to join these folks, but we're really honored to have 3 national leaders who've been at this for a long time, who care about students and families and communities every day. And they wake up thinking about how to help them. They go to sleep thinking about how to help them, and they do make a tangible impact. And so you can read their bios again, but we have Jody Grant, the CEO of the After School Alliance, a tireless leader and partner for all of us. I would say maybe the single greatest defender of the 21st century funding we have, but it's a huge collaboration. But thank you for being an amazing voice, partner, and leader for all of us, and huge partner to NSLA. And we want to work with the After School Alliance everywhere we can to support all our partners in the field. Karen Pittman from the Forum for Youth Investment, who's had an illustrious career, and you can read her whole bio, but has always been at the forefront of thinking and leadership on behalf of youth, and her institution does so much and puts great reports and leadership, bringing people together across different silos of education always, and also has a lot of experience with government and policy and understands these issues. And then Billy Shore, who also has an illustrious career both in government and nonprofit and in general, but it would share our strength and real focus on hunger issues and food insecurity, and the No Kid Hungry campaign, if people are familiar with that. So, and Billy's also an illustrious writer, and you should check out some of his books, and his podcasts, and all this other stuff. He's everywhere, but he's always fighting. And we wanted to bring all these perspectives together as we're all in a position more than ever to kind of meet the needs and the demands of our families and students we serve, and our program partners and our districts. And now with the new administration and a new White House and a new Congress, people's ears and eyes and hearts and minds are hopefully open in a way that we don't always get the chance to kind of make our case. So with all that said, we're welcoming back Reggie Love as our moderator of this panel, and I'll turn it over to you, Reggie, to lead us through the next discussion.
Well, that's great, and thank you for introducing everybody, and thank you for our panelists taking the time out of their busy schedules to be a part of this conversation. Clearly, I've read your bios and have seen how much work that you guys have put into such an important space, and you guys being here today only reinforces the fact that you guys are committed to these very complicated issues that really affect our community. So to start there, I mean, in the last conversation, we spoke a lot about COVID-19 and a lot of the challenges that it had caused in the greater educational world. And obviously, it has thrown our education system and our children and our families into a prolonged summer. And so, with the combination of, and in some scenarios, summer started in March or in February, or for some kids as well. So given that learning loss is already an issue, and in combination with COVID-19 and probably the larger impact, what should a new Congress and administration do to tackle some of the issues around learning loss, or to help alleviate what impact has been made? And I'll start with, we'll start with the bottom with me, with Jody, and then we'll work up to Billy and then to Karen.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Reggie, and thank you, everyone. I think I'm going to build off where the last panel ended. And when we're talking about, first of all, when we're talking about loss, I would encourage, and I think this is natural for our field, for us to first think about the social emotional loss. Our kids have been isolated, many of them, for, going on, like 8 months now. Some of them have experienced trauma before. They're definitely experiencing trauma now, both from COVID, from food insecurity, from the violence that we see on the cameras that's often race related. So I think that, the number one priority we have is to make sure that our kids feel safe, both physically and mentally, and then to think about the academics. That said, I am really hopeful, because when you look at the after school and summer learning space, we serve all kids. We don't ask them what their politics are. We don't ask them what their parents' politics are. We serve them in red areas. We serve them in blue areas. And our field has always had bipartisan support, because people are making a difference on the ground in those programs, in those communities, in every community. So I would say the first thing I'm optimistic for is, I think, the top priority is going to be COVID and the economy. It was mentioned on the last panel, Lisa Murkowski and Tina Smith, Republican and Democrat before the election, introduced legislation that was going to double funding for after school and summer, specifically so that they could continue to create hubs and other opportunities for kids that cannot be learning at home to go somewhere in person where they can learn. And I'm really excited. We're watching these hubs crop up all across the country, where kids can be kept in small pods with 1 or 2 adults. So if somebody gets sick, they shut down the pod, but not the entire program. And they're able to do virtual learning and have the hardware, software, internet support, but also get enrichment support, academic support, get meals. And I think that, we need to be doing more of that and get kids, because I can guarantee that wealthier kids are interacting now. They're getting enrichment, they're getting tutors, they're getting pods. And so it's, in some ways it's a Band-Aid, but it's an urgent Band-Aid. But I would say, I think the next role for federal policymakers, and a lot of this will eventually be done at the state level, in addition to dollars, both for after school and summer, and we're seeing some CARES Act dollars from childcare and governor's dollars go into our space, is we can't go back to education as we know it. And there is a huge role for summer here. I think we need to start envisioning that learning happens all the time, not just in those school walls, not just with teachers. And we need to think about our space as a place where students can get credit for the work they're doing. So thinking of it like electives, whether it's an internship, an apprenticeship, a hybrid virtual learning opportunity that they don't have somewhere else, whether it's a coding class or robotics class, an environmental science class, finding ways to use our space to help kids catch up during the recovery, because a longer school day, making them go to school all summer is not gonna be great for anyone. And this is a great way that we can support and supplement the work our teachers do, while giving our kids a lot more choices to really embrace learning that plays to their strengths and their specific passions.
Okay, that's great. And Billy, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Reggie. Completely agree with what Jody said. I thought she laid it out really well. I'll maybe address a narrower, but I think important aspect of this when it comes to kids in this country who are hungry and how that affects their ability to learn. There have been so many terrible reversals as a result of this pandemic, and that's been true when it comes to childhood hunger as well. But I would make the case that of all the aspects of this pandemic and frankly of many social challenges we have in this country, that childhood hunger is the most solvable of them. We don't have shortage, we have, when it comes to the pandemic, we're worried about shortages of vaccines and ventilators. We worry about shortages of childcare professionals and well-paid teachers. We don't have shortages of food or food programs in this country. And one of the things that we were seeing, and it's ironic that and tragic that we're in this position right now, is we were seeing really for the first time in the 35 years that I've been doing this work, a place where kids might have been poor and their families might have been food insecure, but they weren't hungry. So I'll give you an example. In El Monte, California, the superintendent of schools there is Maribel Garcia. She's on our board of directors, so she's helped me get a really intimate look into what's going on in the El Monte school system. And pre-pandemic, she took me to a school where there were 800 kids. 99% of them lived at or below the poverty line. A significant percentage of them were homeless. Many of their parents were undocumented and could not get really good paying work. In the past, that would have been a prescription for also being hungry. There would have been a set of social determinants that those kids were hungry, but they weren't. They were getting breakfast in the classroom. They were getting a school lunch. Many of them were getting an after-school supper or snack. So still a long way to go in terms of poverty and food insecurity, but at least these kids had a chance to learn. All of that, of course, gets wiped away by the pandemic. So many schools are closed or open in a hybrid fashion. Kids aren't getting 3 meals a day. Dorothy McAuliffe, the former First Lady of Virginia, who works very closely with us, often says that kids can't be hungry for knowledge if they're just plain hungry. This is, though, a piece of the puzzle that we can solve with appropriate action, not just at the federal level, but at the state level as well.
No, those are really good points. I appreciate that, Billy. And Karen, how about yourself?
Of course, agree with my colleagues, Jody and Billy, and good to see you, Billy. It's been a couple decades,
Yes, Karen.
at least. The points made, I think, are critical. And when we think about what happened when schools closed abruptly, we saw activity at the top and bottom end of Maslow's needs hierarchy, right? So we saw schools trying to deliver food. We have all this food, we got to get it out to kids, and we're going to get them computers. And somehow, if we just get them, Chromebooks, that academic part of learning will happen. And as Jody said, it's the stuff in the middle. So we started talking about warm spots. So we were literally looking for hot spots for kids to sort of pull in so they could turn their Chromebooks on and do virtual learning, when it's the things in the middle, the relationships, the social and emotional relationships, the routines, the recognition that comes along from being a part of a group. All of those things are what make young people resilient. And all of those things, when done well, happen in school. But we think, when we just think the extremes, schools are places where kids, poor kids get to eat, and all kids supposedly get to learn, we underestimated the hole that happened for a lot of kids when schools suddenly closed. I love the phrase prolonged summer, but I really want to push on it and say we have an opportunity right now if we're going to build forward together. And that's really sort of the slogan that we've taken up at the Readiness Projects and the forum to say, can we get to 2021, ideally with a vaccine coming, and start to think about how to build forward, not back to normal, but how to build forward, how to do it together. And when you mention the idea of prolonged summer, I just want to push on that. I think that is the perfect place to start the conversation because nobody owned summer, right? Assuming that you had resources, summer was a place where you might have been doing some things connected to school. You might have been doing some things connected to an after-school youth development summer program. You might have been in a camp. You were taking family vacations or just taking time off. Somehow, summer learning was happening in all of those spaces in an unorganized way that was negotiated with families and young people at the helm of determining where they wanted their learning to happen. That's what we need to carry forward. That shouldn't just be a temporary fix. That really is what we know about how learning happens. Meaning making happens when young people and families have as much control as possible over where, when, how, and with whom learning happens. That doesn't mean that we don't care about academic content. That doesn't mean that we don't care about making sure young people are meeting basic performance standards and building competencies. But this idea, as Jody said, that somehow learning isn't happening because young people aren't in chairs in schools is crazy. So the question for me starts with, if we recognize that this disruption has created a huge opportunity for us to really sort of rethink how to present learning, we're suggesting we have a chance to build forward together to put forward a plan, an 18-month plan for expanded learning with a particular focus on adolescents because they're going to get forgotten because they don't need childcare. How do we really think spring, summer, school year, next summer, so we have a chance to really get this locked in and bring all of those partners to the table to really look at the assets that they have in terms of the time commitment, the dollars, the staff, the materials, the particular focus and approach that they bring to learning, recognizing that all this needs to happen, but we have to do it together or we're going to lurch. We're going to finish out the school year. We're going to compete for summer. Do we put the kids in summer school? We're going to have a mess, and we have an opportunity to really build forward together. And any signals that we can get, and I know that there's a piece circulating about having a White House office on children and youth and thinking about a children's cabinet. Anything that we can do to signal that the opportunity to build forward together has to have education in the middle, but it can't solely be led by education would be a terrific signal.
No, well, look, I think that your comments around using this as an opportunity to do something courageous and to really hit home on some of these issues that we've been trying to get at for quite some time, I think is spot on. And Aaron,
I just wanted
Jody, what's your point?
I just wanted to flag what Karen said because I think it's spot on. And from the beginning of this pandemic, we've been urging school districts to bring out-of-school time providers, CBOs to the table. But I want to flag that this is a concern of mine too, because what we found is that not everyone's been open to building forward together, and I think it's necessary. And I have to say, I'm a little alarmed because while there's all of this hope with the new administration, there's no one from our community on the transition team, as far as I know right now. I flagged that for them. So I would urge all of you to push that point because we can't build forward together if we're not at the table, even if we have the best ideas in the world.
I think that's a really good point. Really good point. We should flag that again for the transition team. Aaron, what are your comments?
Well, I appreciate hearing what everyone's perspectives and what they're working on, and that's what I was saying. We have real national leaders who are really bringing all their perspective and all these partners together in a way that we haven't seen. I think since COVID started, I don't know. I'll speak for myself. I was invited into more circles with unlikely partners talking about how can they help and how can they work with the out of school time field, and people who just, by necessity, they wanted to help, they had to help, the resources were there, the demand was there. And I would just emphasize, we have a lot of partners, and Karen's completely correct. The business community, so many companies wanted to create curriculum for students that they could use at home and families. And that wasn't only self-serving to promote themselves. They really wanted to share what they had, but didn't know how to connect with us, and didn't know where to begin. And maybe they don't have curriculum expertise, but even if they created a good curriculum, how do they distribute it and get something out, or training and mentoring? So I just want to kind of flag, as we build this kind of a broader tent coalition around our issues, that I think there is just a lot of different unlikely allies even who care. I'll also share something that I would take as a positive around this whole experience we're having, which is, if you were a upper middle class family since March, you had I would almost call it an empathetic aha moment of the struggles low-income families have. I'm not saying they're equal by any means, but I had a lot of folks who had a lot of resources with kids at home, having technical issues with computers, didn't know how to work and support their kids. And then what ultimately came up was, they said, is this the struggle that working families have over the summer months? Is this something? And of course we say yes, and they had every resource. So can you imagine all the millions of people who don't? So what I think, that's a little bit of something else that we can kind of tap into here, that people understand all our different issues that we've been fighting for so long. Maybe there might be a larger audience for them. And then one last thing I'll just share is, for us, summer learning, but I love what Jody was saying about how do we get credit, academic recovery credit and all this. When you get to be in the older age groups, if we talk about high school, summer youth employment is a form of summer learning. Not a lot of people think of it that way. It could be enhanced, it could have academic requirements, it could have literacy and math requirements, but you could also tie it into what they're working and getting real work experience and getting paid and getting fed, building their resumes. And then one last thing I'll just flag as well on this is, I think it's our chance to actually do away with the unpaid internship, which we know matters a lot in terms of getting real jobs, but is totally discriminatory and off limits to so many folks. And I think there's a recognition, and again, how, as we're talking about equity, and especially an equity experience that doesn't happen that happens mostly over the summer, these summer internships. If you wanted to work for a member of Congress, you had to figure out a way to somehow do an unpaid internship, or if they paid you very little, you had to figure out all the other costs to cover. And those folks end up in policy positions. And so if we want a staff, not just a Congress, but the staff around the Congress to look like America, we need to make those opportunities available. So I'm just flagging a few things that I'm hearing and a few things we're trying to work on, but it's this creativity and collaboration that I think will drive us.
If I can pick up on Aaron's point, the older adolescents, the summer youth employment issue, really, I think Congress is going to be concerned, and rightfully so, that we're going to have a lot of young people who are not coming back. We have just lost them. They've never logged in. It wasn't working for them before. Somehow, a vaccine comes, they're just not going to walk back in the door a year later. Our high school graduation rates, unless we do something very drastic, are going to go back to where they were a decade ago after all this work. Now you can debate what a high school diploma meant, but at least we had made progress on moving that number. And there's a lot of concern, and there's a lot of concern at the state level. If your dollars are associated with attendance, you're going to lose a lot of young people in these years. We need a very different response for capturing them. And we know from the work that we've done with Opportunity Youth, who had already dropped out of school, that business, you were talking about business earlier, business can play a critical role in bringing those young people back in and sort of leapfrogging over. Don't put them back in the classroom that wasn't working for them, virtual or not. Bring them into a business opportunity, provide the social emotional supports. They can catch up remedially if they're motivated and move forward with some kind of degree. So this is an opportunity to really think very differently. And I would absolutely put something on the table that is a big push, whether it's a push that combines service with employment, with sort of early post-secondary. There's an opportunity to do something in that space so we don't just lose potentially a third of our high school students.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting comment. And, you know, I think you're right. We are gonna, you know, if we're not careful, we could just have high levels of attrition of kids who ultimately felt even more disenfranchised through the primary education process. And then when you really think about how many more kids are working in college now, you know, a lot of those needs aren't specifically, so a lot of those financial needs aren't new, right? Those financial needs had been there all along. And as you guys mentioned, programs around summer youth employment as a credit or as payment or paid internships, you know, could be really, really impactful. Now, I want to, this is not in the list of comments or questions that came about, but I'm going to go to the comment board because there's a really good question on tutoring. But before that, Jody, you mentioned that you operate programs in red states and blue states. And in the places where you were in person, how did you deal with issues around safety protocols for COVID, given that you may believe in science in places where certain local officials may not have believed in science the same way?
You know, it's interesting because the After School Alliance works with 50 state networks, and this absolutely comes up, right? Like, what do we do when people aren't wearing masks? But the answer is, you know, from day one, the after school field pivoted and was taking care of the children of essential workers. And what this means is they're not just taking care of kids in these, you know, pods and hubs, they're taking care of kids whose parents are more likely to be exposed than others. And they've made a mandate with safety protocols. So the biggest thing is all the non-pharmaceutical interventions. So, you know, small groups of kids, 1 or 2 adults, you know, can cleaning, masks, sanitizing, temperature checks, not so much because you could be sick without it, but doing a interview, you know, every morning before the kids come in and making it clear if you're going to take advantage of this situation, right, the care, you need to follow those protocols. I'd also say we work very closely with NSLA, sharing the recommendations of the summer camps, so the Camp Association on protocol. And what we have found is in the vast majority of places, kids have been healthier because there's a bunch of illnesses they're not getting when they're following these protocols. So yes, I think, you know, programs have to be willing to say, you know, this isn't about your personal beliefs. These are the protocols you and your family need to follow. And if there's an indication that they're not, then, you know, you can't endanger the rest of the group. But it's definitely, we've seen these programs succeed in all parts of the country, but there's definitely a few places where I can say it's harder because, you know, you have to, safety is, you know, there's a reason they call it public health, not private health. So, so yes, that's, you know, it's just something you have to deal with on a community by community basis.
That's interesting. And Karen or Billy or Aaron, have you guys had to deal with this issue?
We have not dealt with it directly from our organization, but as we're watching these examples come in from across the country, much like Jody, and come in the opportunity use space as well, you know, we agree 100% with Jody. Folks have really sort of, you know, put protocols in place from a public health perspective, regardless of which kind of state they were in. That has been the ticket to admission. And when you're talking directly to families and families are looking for safe care for their young people, they appreciate that. Interestingly, just as a side point, I heard a factoid on NPR this morning in terms of going back to school and families feeling comfortable sending their kids back to school, that 70% of young people from white families are back in school, but only 40% of young people from African-American families. Some of that is because their schools aren't as well resourced, but some of that is also just a trust factor. They really don't trust that those schools have their kids in mind, and they would rather send them to the kind of organizations where they have the relationships. As you all mentioned, when you've made the investment in the relationships, families will return to you.
So
I listened to that same show, by the way. The stats were staggering.
Reggie, I'll just answer your question from a slightly different dimension of not the experience with protocols in place now, but the experience of some protocols that have gone out the window in a way that I think is very good for some of our summer objectives. And they're not necessarily COVID protocols, but they came about as a result of it. It's always been a challenge of ours, and we've worked closely with NSLA on this, on how do you feed kids in the summertime. There's so many obstacles to doing it. We have 22 million kids in the country who get a free or reduced price school lunch. They're all eligible for breakfast, but only 12 million are getting it, and only about 3 million are getting summer meals. So many hurdles and barriers to doing that. In the first relief package that came after COVID, Congress and the regulatory agencies threw most of those out the window. They enabled us to start feeding kids without, through waivers and other types of knocking down barriers. We started feeding kids in ways that we never could before. Off-site, didn't have to be on a congregate basis, could feed multiple meals at a time so they could take them home. Parents could pick them up. One of the real opportunities here for all of us is to say we've developed a proof of concept about some things that work, that people were once concerned might lead themselves to fraud or abuse. They don't. They get food to kids when they need it, where they need it. And if we can keep those flexibilities in place, we can end up with a very different, a much more positive situation in future summers.
Well, I would appreciate that work, because I remember how big of an issue it was to be able to pick up food for multiple individuals, and a lot of schools, districts were slow to figure out that was a negative impact on making every individual have to come and pick up their food. So I love that you guys were doing that, and that's really, it's, to Aaron's point, it's one of those things that we don't really think about until we actually kind of experience or see it, through the proper lens to address it. So greatly appreciate it. Aaron, did you have any comments on this topic?
Well,
or do you want to move to the next?
Well, I mean, one thing I would like to actually throw back to Billy, because I think, Billy, you've done a million things well that are inspiring. But one thing that I think for all of us could learn from is a little bit about the way you've engaged media partners, the way you've gotten corporate partners to kind of take on your issue. And hunger is, especially for young people, is a major issue, and you could say, oh, it's a no-brainer, everyone should get involved. But so are after school and summer program. There are a lot of things that seem obvious and should be important. And I think we're all just trying to figure out, like, how do we bring attention from outside groups to this to help bring some leverage and influence on Congress as well, so they listen in different ways. So I'd love to just hear from you, if you don't mind, Reggie, to throw this back to Billy, just to hear any lessons you've learned as you've kind of built more support and kind of maybe almost unlikely support for your cause.
Yeah, it's a great question, Aaron. I don't know that I've got the magic solution for it, but I would say that our frame of mind has always been that if enough people cared about these issues as much as those of us who are convened here today, we wouldn't have to work so hard or fight so hard to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So we've got to figure out ways not just to preach to the choir, but to make that choir grow. And so our orientation has always been to, kind of look for the unusual suspects. How do we take the work that we're doing to, let's say, a corporate partner and say, please think of this as wet clay. We've developed some assets here. Some of it might have to do with a brand that's valuable. Some of it might have to do with proprietary information. Some of it might have to do with other assets that we've developed. And could you use those? Could you align yourself with this cause? Not only because it's the right thing to do, but because you would really receive some benefit out of it, and we would work with you. And all of our relationships with corporate partners, and it's really turbocharged our growth and enabled us to feed a lot of kids. It's come as a result of this starting point where we say, let's come up with a partnership that's going to be good for us and those we serve, but also good for you. So it's a little bit of a different mentality than you just need to do this because it's the right thing to do, although that would be my first choice, of course. But in fact, many of them get involved for reasons that might have some commercial benefit. And I think because they're human beings like all the rest of us and want to be involved in doing something meaningful in the community, end up staying involved or expanding their involvement because they really want to be making a difference in the world. And it's enabled us to grow in ways that we just never could have.
Thank you for that, Bill. Appreciate it. And that's a really good question, Aaron. I think if anything, what we've learned is that we have to definitely understand the motivations of our partners, but also use new ideas and new mediums and new technologies to help articulate and effectively communicate topics and themes that continue to bring folks to the conversation and to the table. I'm going to pivot to a question that came in on the chat. It says, research shows that a high dosage tutoring is effective to reverse learning loss. Is there an appetite for federal policy to support such programs, whether through schools or in out-of-school time programs, via national service programs, or other ways to engage college students and professionals, et cetera? Anyone feel free to start. Since it's random, I don't know who has thoughts on that.
I'll defer to Karen or Jody
go ahead,
first.
Aaron.
Yeah. No, go ahead. I'll jump in after you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I think that, one of the things you heard loud and clear on the last panel is we do need to, budget is going to be an issue with the split Congress. So I do think, investing in education is one of the smartest things you can do, and investing in learning because it pays back. But I think you have seen some calls for an expanded AmeriCorps. I would look to, one of the sponsors of that was Senator Coons, who is very close to President-elect Biden. I think there could be some incredible opportunities, whether it's one-on-one tutoring or just, again, this learning outside walls that fits really nicely into our space. So, one of the things, that is possible right now is for colleges for students to get work study credit for working after school. I like the emphasis on we should be paying people and it should be learning. That the two often go hand in hand. I think I've learned in every single job I've had. And so I think there is an appetite. I think I would structure it again as locally, because a lot of this needs to be, worked out with a combination of federal, state, and local. But to really tap into youth, working with youth as part of the solution here.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I love the proof of concept idea that you talked about, sort of Billy having, as he sort of looked for all the possible ways to sort of make sure young people have food and aren't hungry. I think every time we bring up one of these traditional solutions to a problem, we have a chance to challenge what we mean by it. So, do we understand that tutoring can actually sort of mitigate learning loss? Of course. I mean, yes, there is research behind it, but we would be surprised if it didn't. But can we break down what that is? Does that tutoring have to mean tutoring from a certified teacher? Is tutoring as much, especially in these times, about a relationship and about connecting as it is about the actual content that's being put in place? What are we getting when we say we've connected a young person who wasn't doing well to some other person who's going to care about them, get to know them, and then help guide them through whatever the learning is that's happening? And then we can ask the question, and how many ways could we make that happen? And again, that's just where we are over and over again. We're in this proof of concept where the traditional way of doing it isn't going to be feasible, whether it's financially feasible, physically feasible, because we can't put people in the same space. There are so many reasons why the thing that we used to do, even though it didn't work very well, was the thing we used to do. So we were risk averse to changing it. Well, if it can't work now, we really have a chance to do proof of concept ideas in a lot of spaces. And one of them is exactly as Jody said. I don't have to be a certified teacher to motivate a kid to get back in. I have to come in with a relationship. I have to have some information about the content. I have to know when I'm out of my league. I could do this with a group of young people. We could be, we talked about summer employment. We've got plenty of young people who, and we do have studies that show that when you engage high school students in tutoring younger students, both of them learn and gain. So lots of things here that we can be doing if we just put all the things that we need on the table. And I think that's where getting the the comprehensive picture of what it is that young people need to have, and asking as creatively as possible, where could we get it? And then figuring out new ways to get it to them is what we could be doing. And if we do that in this next 18 months with a real amount of discipline and data collection, so it's not just a bunch of anecdotes at the end of this, we could have enough of a big proof of concept to not go back to normal.
Yes, I'd like to just add, I'll just add something that I'm always taking inspiration from, which is how we have so much youth development infrastructure in this country that's already there. And so we're talking about how do you create more individualized, meaningful relationships. What about all the sports coaches in America and all about whether they're paid or volunteer who are building relationships, could be doing more, could be asked to be doing more, could be brought into our work. The mentoring movement, which there are thousands upon thousands of organizations that think of themselves only strictly as mentoring, but could be asked to kind of expand their responsibilities and come into us. The camp counselor community, which seems, has been historically very driven by economic class. The overnight summer camp experience, middle and upper middle class children are able to access, and then those students come back and serve as counselors, where they get trained on working with kids. And you meet people all the time who said, we had John King yesterday on our call say, I was going to be a lawyer and then I worked at a summer camp. And so I would just tell you that there are millions of people who have this kind of youth development experience and maybe perspective, and then are not asked to do anything with it.
That's right.
And so how do we break down? And one of the things, I'll give Karen all the credit, because right out of the gate when COVID happened, and you wrote a very powerful article, I may not get the title correct, but the theme was that, out of school time was all the time. And that I took a lot of inspiration from. And I'll just tell you that, and a lot of us, I think that was a very meaningful, impactful piece, Karen, because a lot of us started having conversation. Well, what does it look like if you were a good summer program that was effective with young people? Why are you stopping in August?
Right.
Why don't you keep going? And by the way, if you're a good after school program that is getting gains on literacy and math and relationship building, why are you going to wait till 3 o'clock in the afternoon now? And conversely, so that all this morphing was happening. And it's so funny because sometimes if you have all the resources in the world and you're the highest echelon economic, there's this kind of race to the top where people are trying to find all new experiences all the time. But if you have no resources, it also drives creativity and the flexibility Billy was talking about. All of a sudden, it's like, can we get rid of some of these regulations so we can just get to the work? And I don't know what the paradox is about that, but I just think that there are just so many more groups and entities and silos that we can break down those walls. We'll have more people who can then deliver this kind of more individualized, impactful, personalized education.
I agree with you 100%. The one word I would challenge would be infrastructure. We have an incredible wealth of people and resources. I mean, people and talent and organizational resources out there. It is not visible. It is not connected, and it is basically not equitable. So if we really want to have an infrastructure in which we could come into a community and say, activate your community infrastructure to partner with schools and families to get this done. We don't even have the language to know who that community infrastructure is. So the call that I just jumped off of was really about how do we make if we think all of these community partners are so essential and so visible, why can't we find them? And I mean, we know how to find them, but I've had more than enough conversations with school folks who, if you ask them to name their community partners, they'll go, well, there's the Y, and then I think there's 4-H, and then there's the faith community. I mean, it's a random list that gets named. So it really is up to us if we want to step into this space to really say that we have this power and influence and resources, and then also acknowledge that it's uneven, but also everything that you said, why don't we just expand from after school to full day? Why don't we just run summer year round? It's called money. And until we actually can make the case that we have that capacity to not just be where and when kids go when school closes and families can't, want something for their kids to do, but that we really are powerful learning and development organizations, and incredibly diverse at that, when we can make that case, then I think we'll be better able to respond when people, want us to actually operate at scale. Our challenge is we're rarely asked to operate at scale.
I just want to be
nationally, I mean, sort of locally.
I want to be a little provocative on that, which is that I think it's really important as we do this work to remember that we're not teachers. And so when we talk about going to like all day long and things like that, I think there's a really important role in learning for our teachers. And there's a really important role in learning for positive youth development, and a whole second set of educators who are truly educators that are in our space. And I think that, the best possible worlds are where they complement and supplement each other. But I just want to flag, we're not talking about creating whole new school systems and replacing teachers here. We're talking about creating an ecosystem that is much larger and broader of, what counts as learning towards a kid's education.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Totally agree as well. Yes.
Well, given that point, and given the point of some out of school programs being disconnected from the right partner and partner channels, what should OST programs be doing to address these special populations of students that are, struggling learners, immigrants, older youth, or disengaged youth? Like, what are you seeing that's working to help increase the funnel of kids that are being touched, and what are the things that are not working to get more kids into the funnel? And we can start with why don't we start with Billy, since you have been a little quiet.
Well, I guess the only point I would make here, because I don't have the same expertise in out of school that Karen and Jody and Aaron do, is that just to urge us all to look at this as holistically as possible, because one of the things that we always find in our work, and I think it's true of this as well, is although there's everybody's in favor of feeding a hungry child, but not everybody's in favor of doing all the things we need to do to make sure that child's not hungry in the first place. And I think that until all of us embrace a larger agenda of getting to the root causes of why we have these issues, whether they're education issues or hunger issues or poverty issues, until we find ways to embrace a larger agenda of strengthening not just kids, but their families, their caretakers, their households, we're going to continue to, take only a step forward and maybe a step back. So I think this new administration creates an opportunity for all of us to get behind a broader agenda, but unless we start to deal with some of the fundamental inequities, which everybody on this panel has a track record of doing really great work on, but I think we have to constantly urge and advocate with our stakeholders to look at that bigger picture.
No, I think that's spot on. You got to cure the sickness, not just the symptoms. Aaron, do you have any thoughts or comments?
I would just ask, kind of from all the panelists' experience, what have you seen work in terms of actually building the tactics and the strategies and the coalition to actually enact and pass the legislation we'd want to see in a new Congress? It could go back. I know we're fighting very hard to protect existing funding, so it's sometimes hard to go and create new funding, and there's limited funding. But to get these initiatives going, and I would, again, Billy, from your perspective, Jody, Karen, you've seen efforts fail, you've seen efforts work. What's something that we could kind of learn from what you've seen?
I'm going to start because this is our bread and butter. Yeah. And the first thing I want to do is, I actually haven't done this yet, but I want to thank everybody on this call, because many of you are on the front lines. And whether you are providing in-person services or virtual services or delivering meals and lesson plans, you're really doing extraordinary things to help our kids through a very tough time. So I wanted to say thank you. And then I wanted to tie that to, I think the most important thing is advocacy. So your community needs to know what you're doing. They need to know what you're doing now during COVID, and that means your school board, your local papers. When I talk about advocacy, it's not just policymakers, your state legislators, your federal legislators. And while data is really helpful, stories can be super powerful. So the more that you can shine a light on what you're doing, that's how we win the hearts and the minds of our leaders to make things happen. And that's, I think that's where I started when I talked about the community level. But I think now more than ever, I think one of the challenges of our field is people think it's childcare, which of course ignores all of the older youth. But also, there's nothing wrong with childcare. It's great, but we do so much more. It's just like, we were attacked for feeding hungry kids, and like that's great. But as Billy says, there's so much more. I think that it's imperative. Do it, at your church, at your synagogue. People need to understand what our field's doing, and that's when we build support into actual policy action.
The only thing I would add to that is I think we owe it to ourselves and to those we're trying to support, empower, to be really clear about what success looks like. I find one of the easiest things to do in this work is to keep doing it, but not really defining in a really crystal clear way, a measurable way, what success looks like. When we've done that well, it's inspired everybody from donors to policy makers. And when we've not, it's had the opposite effect. We had early on in our work, we convened a lot of our colleagues in the anti-hunger community, and we said we had a plan for ending childhood hunger by a date certain. And if there were 60 people in the room, 59 of them were energetically and passionately opposed to what we suggested. They were almost, they were just not comfortable with having a very specific measurable goal. But when you have it, everything else falls into place. So totally agree with what you said, Jody, about advocacy and about storytelling. Me, all that's got to be in the service of very specific thing we're trying to accomplish. And we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And when we miss, people can make their own decisions about why we missed and whether they should continue to support us. But when we succeed, I think we deserve more support.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I would add in a couple
Karen,
of disparate but sort of quick examples, some in our space, some not, in terms of just the after-school space per se. But to speak to your question of where have we seen success, and even relatively recently, one is, in the last Congress, we saw a Reconnecting Youth campaign get broad bipartisan support and actually put money back into programs for these older youth when people thought you weren't going to get any money. And that was a combination of data, of concrete examples, and of advocacy done directly by young people themselves, whom we often forget the power of actually having them show up. But it was also a very clear, tangible goal that says we can reconnect young people. The cost of not reconnecting them is huge. The possibilities of reconnecting them are very clear. Here's a dozen federal programs. If you cobble them together and put more money into them, this will create pathways for another 1 million young people to move forward. You got it. Another example done a couple years ago, but the idea of performance partnership pilots, the idea that down at the local level, by the time Congress passes money to get down to communities, that money is so fragmented and so fraught with regulation that people have a hard time cobbling it together. It's like a full-time job to add up all the pieces. We started that in 1994 when I was at the President's Crime Prevention Council. It only took us until about a couple years ago to actually get legislation through. So, if you've got a couple of decades, we can do it. But it passed again with huge support. And my final example at the local level, which I think we really can stand up, is when you look across the country at the number of ballot initiatives where people have actually put funding for children's services and after-school services, discretionary funding on the ballot, and raise tax dollars to do it, that is not a partisan issue. That is a communication issue. And those are the kind of things that I think we can be doing and supporting.
Yeah, well, look, I think, Karen, I think your point is spot on, right? Change does not happen overnight. And a lot of these fights we've been fighting for a long time, and we're going to continue to fight them into the future. And so appreciate all of not only the work that you've done, but all of the work that all of our panelists have done in our communities, supporting families and supporting children all over the country. And so I think we might be sort of coming up on time. I'm not sure if anyone had any specific comments or points that we didn't get to, and I apologize to all of our participants if we didn't get to all of your questions, but feel free to reach out to the team at NSLA if we can help follow up on any of those questions, which were very, very good. And we appreciate everyone being here today. I believe I will turn it over to Aaron.
Yep. Well, thank you, Reggie. And I wish we were in a big crowd and we could all, give you a round of applause. But thank you, Jody and Billy and Karen, so much for your continuous leadership and your insights and your commitment to partnership and to serving students and families and communities and in ways that are holistic, like we said. And I think I'll just echo, what I've heard from our two discussions, that we're in a real moment of opportunity and transition for this country with this election and now with the policy implications. None of us can do it alone. It does feel very lonely sometimes, all of us, especially in this kind of COVID moment. But the fact is that we have so many allies to tap into, from the grassroots to the grass tops, that it gets connected, and the multi-sector, from the government, nonprofit, and business. And the only policies I've ever seen sustain themselves is when you had the multi-sector coalition behind it. And that was, one sector can maybe solve it for a while by themselves, but it only keeps going if everyone's brought into it. I think we heard that a lot today. So, yesterday we talked about program quality. Today we talked about policy. And tomorrow we're going to end our Summer Solution Series with a real focus on partnerships and looking at how we leverage them in addressing racial equity in education. We have a phenomenal panel of national leaders on that panel discussion starting at 1 o'clock. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to move with National League of Cities and highlighting the city of San Francisco. And we have the CEO of the Public Housing Association, the Library Association, and the Parks and Rec Association, all talking about what we addressed a little bit here today. How do we leverage communities as learning hubs and leverage these anchor resources we have already existing that may not have always connected, but how do we do it in a better way, to say build forward, as Karen is saying we need to do, to really tackle these issues, solve these issues, and make progress on them. So a heartfelt thanks to all the leaders who've been with us the last 2 days. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Reggie for your leadership and moderating abilities today. And we look forward, and you can please feel free to invite any of your teams or your staff or your networks to join us again tomorrow at 1 o'clock for the last day of our Summer Solution Leadership Series. Thank you, and we'll be in touch.